In the cold streets of medieval Europe, words could kill. Not words of heresy, not words of treason, but words whispered by women. In a world where silence was demanded of them, to speak too freely, too sharply, too often was a crime that carried its own kind of death. They called it scolding, a harmless word today, but in the 15th and 16th centuries, it marked a woman for humiliation, pain, and public destruction. Scolds were wives, widows, or servants accused of gossiping, of speaking ill of neighbors, challenging men, or stirring discord. Sometimes, all it took was a single complaint, a single insult, or even the sound of laughter in the marketplace to bring punishment upon them. In England, Scotland, and across Germany, towns kept official instruments for these women. Iron masks forged not for battle, but for silence. They were called Scolds, Bridles, or Branks. The design was simple and horrifying. A metal frame, hinged to fit around the head like a cage, locking at the back of the skull. Inside, a protruding plate or spike pressed down or pierced the tongue, ensuring that speech, even the smallest word, brought agony. Some Branks were plain, others were sculpted into grotesque forms. The snout of a pig, the face of a demon, or the grin of a fool. The punishment was not just pain. It was mockery, once clamped in place. The condemned woman was led through the streets, often by rope or chain, children through mud. Men jeered. Church bells rang as though for a festival, but what they celebrated was shame. The woman's every step echoed the message that silence was safety and speech was sin. Records from Newcastle in 1567 describe one such woman, Alice Witch, paraded through the market with the iron biting her tongue. Witnesses said her eyes were filled with tears, not from pain alone, but from the laughter that surrounded her. Her crime? She had accused a local merchant of cheating his customers and refused to apologize. In another case from the Scottish burgh of Lanark, a widow named Joanna Irvine was forced to wear the bridle for railing words against her husband's kin. She was tied to the town cross for 3 hours as passers-by spat and mocked. The account ends with a note that she spake no more. Some bridles were built with small bells attached, so that even the smallest movement of the head announced the sinner's presence. The noise turned the woman into a spectacle, an unwanted melody of humiliation. But not all scolds survived their punishment. Prolonged parading in winter often led to sickness, frostbite, or death. The iron would cut into skin, draw blood, and cause infection. Some women collapsed under the weight of the mask itself, forged so thick it crushed the jaw and neck. The bridle wasn't the only punishment. In many towns, scolds were tied to carts and dragged through muddy streets, or locked in ducking stools, wooden chairs attached to long beams. Bound tightly, they were lowered into rivers or ponds again and again, as crowds shouted for silence. The colder the water, the better the lesson. A chronicler from Shrewsbury wrote in 1634, "The gossips are drowned without dying, and rise no wiser." The church often sanctioned these punishments, preaching that a gossiping tongue was the devil's tool. In sermons, priests compared such women to serpents, whisperers who tempted men away from God's order. Obedience was holiness, silence was virtue, and anything else was sin. The irony, of course, was that many accused women were not gossiping at all. They had spoken about unpaid debts, cruelty, or injustice. They had questioned decisions, demanded fairness, or simply complained. Their voices were punished not because of what they said, but because they dared to speak at all. In Germany, the punishments took on even more elaborate forms. Some cities crafted sham masking, shame. Masks, heavy iron visages worn for hours or days. Each mask was uniquely designed to reflect the alleged crime. A long tongue for gossip, a pig's face for gluttony, horns for lust. The victim became a walking caricature of their supposed sin. One surviving mask from Nuremberg features a twisted metal tongue that protrudes outward. Impossible to hide. Imagine walking through a market square, wearing your shame in steel, hearing the laughter and feeling every eye burn into you, all for the crime of speaking your mind. By the 17th century, These punishments had become so normalized that towns kept official bridles in storage, ready for use. A record from 1650 lists one iron brank for correction of scolds and unruly women among the public property of a Scottish parish. It was used until at least 1720. Some historians argue that the bridle was not meant to kill, that it was only a warning. But death, in many cases, came all the same. Infection, exposure, humiliation, and despair, all were slow executions. The punishment left scars that lasted long. After the iron was removed, a few rare cases record resistance. In 1623, a woman in Edinburgh struck the constable who tried to place the bridle upon her, breaking his nose. She was beaten and imprisoned, but the record notes her words, "Better my hand than my tongue be chained." Her name was Agnes Grey. Those words survived where her body did not. As centuries passed, the branks fell out of use. Enlightenment thinkers began to call them barbaric, relics of an age ruled by superstition and fear. But the mindset behind them, the desire to silence women through shame, lingered much longer. Even after the irons rusted away, the idea that a woman's words could destroy her reputation, her safety, her life, the belief remained strong. In museums across Europe, a few bridles still exist. They hang behind glass, cold and quiet, their spikes dull with age. Tourists look at them in disbelief, imagining how anyone could have worn such things. But each piece of iron once fit around a living face, a woman whose only crime was her voice. And for every mask we can see today, there were dozens that disappeared, melted down, buried, or simply forgotten, just like the women themselves. Each one had a story, a name, a voice that was never written down, because history was written by those who never wore the mask. In the aftermath of each punishment, silence became more than a lesson. It became a law written into the bones of every woman who witnessed it. Those who saw a neighbor paraded in iron, or heard the echo of bells ringing for a scold, learned what it meant to survive. They learned that safety came from quiet lips, bowed heads, and empty eyes. In towns where the brank was kept, you could feel that silence like a fog, thick, unbroken, heavy with fear. Behind closed doors, husbands held the power to accuse, and wives held the burden of endurance. All it took was a single complaint, a muttered word, a cry in anger, and the bridle could return. There was no trial of fairness, no defense of reason. The word gossip was enough to destroy a reputation, a marriage, or a life. And yet, among the silence, there were whispers, small acts of rebellion that never made it into official records. Some women refused to name the accused, choosing instead to suffer fines or imprisonment. Some helped remove the bridles secretly when guards turned their backs. In one tale from Yorkshire, a blacksmith's wife was said to have stolen the key to her sister's brank and filed the lock open by candlelight, her hands trembling, knowing that discovery meant death. The next morning, the iron mask was found abandoned at the edge of the woods, its captive gone. But for every story of defiance, there were hundreds more of despair. The bridle wasn't only a device of torture. It was a symbol, a tool that built a social order upon fear. It taught that women's words were dangerous, that obedience was purity, and that humiliation was justice. Psychologically, the punishment broke more than bodies. Those who survived often lived in silence for the rest of their lives. They avoided gatherings, kept their heads low, and spoke only when spoken to. Some even refused to eat or drink properly, unable to shake the memory of cold iron cutting their tongue. Chroniclers describe women who forgot their laughter, whose voices never returned after the mask was removed. The men who enforced these punishments rarely saw themselves as cruel. To them, it was correction, the same logic used to justify the whip, the stocks, or the burning stake. Magistrates called the brank a domestic remedy. Priests called it discipline for the unruly. But under the pretense of morality, the punishment became a weapon, one that enforced silence not for virtue, but for control. It wasn't just about stopping words. It was about stopping influence. A woman who could speak could accuse, she could organize, she could be believed, and so, in the eyes of those in power, she could also be dangerous. In the 1600s, as cities grew and the printing press spread ideas faster than ever before, the bridle became the opposite of progress, a symbol of what society feared most, the uncontrolled voice, the voice that questioned, resisted, mocked, or demanded. And so they made examples out of those who dared to use it. Even the process of putting on the bridle was ritualized humiliation. The accused would be brought into the marketplace, made to kneel as a blacksmith or constable locked the cage into place. Sometimes, the crowd was invited to watch, to laugh, to shout. The pain began long before the iron touched flesh. Imagine the sound of it, the clink of the lock, the snap of the hinge, the gasp as the spike pressed against the tongue. The victim's muffled sobs, unable to escape the mask. That sound, that broken, gagged sound, became a warning heard by all. Centuries later, when the bridles were finally outlawed, many towns simply hid them away instead of destroying them. A few were kept as curiosities, reminders of old justice. In some cases, they were displayed in council chambers as trophies of order. It wasn't until the 19th century that reformers began collecting them as evidence of barbarity, displaying them in museums to show how far society had come. But even as they were condemned, the echoes of their purpose survived. The idea that a woman's voice could be a weapon, that to speak to boldly invited punishment, endured in subtler ways. Public shame simply changed form. The iron mask became gossip columns. The parade became rumor. The silence remained the same. When you look at one of those masks today, sitting under soft museum light, it's easy to think of it as a relic, something too cruel, too primitive to ever return. But the truth is, every generation invents its own bridles. They just change shape. Sometimes they're made of law. Sometimes they're made of expectation. Sometimes they're made of fear. In medieval Europe, a woman's silence was enforced with iron. Today, it's enforced with judgment. But the goal is the same, to make the voice disappear before it becomes too powerful. History may not remember every woman who wore the brink, but her silence speaks louder than the laughter of the crowds who mocked her. Her story is carved in the rusted steel, and the names erased from the records, and the emptiness left behind. The Scold's bridle wasn't just a punishment, it was a mirror. It showed what society truly feared, not gossip, not rebellion, but truth spoken aloud. And for every woman who wore the mask, there were hundreds more who watched and learned that the price of speech was suffering. But there were also a few who didn't forget. Women who, centuries later, would pick up pens instead of being fitted with bridles and write the history that had been silenced for so long. Because every silenced voice leaves an echo, and history, no matter how it tries, can never silence an echo forever. If you found the story haunting, remember, it isn't just history. It's a warning. How many masks still exist today? Invisible but real, waiting to quiet those who dare to speak. Don't let silence win. Share their story. Let the world hear what was once forbidden.